The autumn wind carried the scent of burning leaves and approaching winter as it rattled the windows of the modest, white farmhouse that had been home to 19-year-old Rebecca Sullivan for her entire life. She stood at the kitchen sink, her hands trembling as she scrubbed the same plate for the third time, trying to gather the courage for a conversation that would change everything. Behind her, the familiar sounds of evening filled the house, her father's heavy footsteps on the wooden floor, her mother's gentle humming as she mended clothes by lamplight, and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock that had belonged to her grandmother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca pressed her hand to her still flat stomach, where a secret had been growing for nearly 3 months. A secret that had kept her awake for countless nights, staring at the ceiling and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The nausea that had plagued her mornings was finally subsiding, but the weight of her situation grew heavier each day. She couldn't hide it much longer. Soon, her body would betray what her heart already knew: she was carrying a child, and she was completely alone. The father was gone. Thomas Mitchell had been the blacksmith's apprentice, a charming young man with golden hair and promises that tasted like honey on summer evenings. He'd whispered words of love under the old oak tree behind the church, painted pictures of their future together with such vivid detail that Rebecca could almost see the little cottage he described, could almost feel the weight of the wedding ring he promised to place on her finger. But when she'd finally found the courage to tell him about the baby, his face had gone white as fresh snow, and by the next morning, he'd vanished like morning mist. The blacksmith said Thomas had family back east, some emergency that required his immediate departure. Rebecca knew better. She'd seen the fear in his eyes, the way he'd stepped backward as if her words were a physical blow. Now 3 weeks later, she stood in her family's kitchen, knowing that the conversation she was about to have would destroy the only security she'd ever known. Her father, William Sullivan, was a God-fearing man whose reputation in their small Nebraska farming community was built on rigid principles and unwavering moral standards. He served as a deacon at their church, led prayers at community gatherings, and spoke often about the importance of living a righteous life. Her mother, Catherine, was gentler but equally devoted to their faith and the expectations of their tight-knit community. Rebecca had been their pride and joy, the daughter who sang solos in the church choir, who helped organize charity drives for the poor, who had never given them a moment's trouble. She was the girl that other parents pointed to as an example for their own children. The thought of disappointing them, of watching their love turn to shame and disgust, made her stomach churn with something far worse than morning sickness. The plate slipped from her soapy hands and clattered against the bottom of the sink. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen, and Rebecca heard her father's footsteps pause in their steady rhythm. "Rebecca, everything all right in there?" William's voice carried the same gentle concern it always had. In a few minutes, that tone would change forever. "Yes, Papa, just finishing the dishes." Rebecca's voice sounded surprisingly steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. She dried her hands on her apron, the same blue-checked apron her mother had sewn for her 16th birthday. Everything in this house held memories: the scarred wooden table where she'd done her lessons, the rocking chair where her mother had sung her to sleep as a child, the family Bible where their names were carefully recorded in her father's precise handwriting. She walked into the sitting room where her parents had settled into their evening routine. Her father sat in his favorite chair, reading from the newspaper by the light of the oil lamp, his weathered face serious as he studied the articles about crop prices and political developments. Her mother occupied the small sofa, her nimble fingers working to repair a tear in one of his work shirts. The scene was so normal, so peaceful, that Rebecca almost turned around and retreated to her room. Maybe she could wait another day, another week. Maybe Thomas would come back. Maybe this was all a terrible dream, but the familiar tightness in her chest that had been her constant companion for weeks reminded her that waiting would only make things worse. Soon, her condition would become obvious to everyone in their community. Better that her parents hear it from her than discover it through gossip and speculation. "Mama, Papa," Rebecca began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to speak with you about something important." William looked up from his newspaper, and Catherine's hand stilled on her mending. They both turned their attention to their daughter, and Rebecca saw nothing but love and mild curiosity in their faces. In a moment, that love would be tested in ways she couldn't bear to imagine. "What is it, sweetheart?" Catherine asked, setting aside her sewing and patting the cushion beside her. "Come sit with us." Rebecca remained standing, knowing that if she sat down, if she allowed herself to feel safe and loved for even another moment, she might lose her nerve entirely. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." Something in her tone must have alerted them to the seriousness of the situation. William folded his newspaper carefully and placed it on the side table, while Catherine's face grew more concerned. "Rebecca, you're scaring us," Catherine said softly. "What's wrong?" "I'm pregnant." The words fell into the quiet room like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to expand and grow with each passing second. "I'm nearly 3 months along, and Thomas is gone. He left town when I told him, and I don't think he's coming back." The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca watched her parents' faces transform as the meaning of her words sank in. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief and dawning horror. Her father's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, and then something harder and colder than Rebecca had ever seen directed at her. "No," William's voice was flat, emotionless. "No, this isn't possible. Not you, not our Rebecca." "Papa, I know this is difficult to hear, but difficult." William stood abruptly, his chair rocking backward from the force. "Difficult doesn't begin to describe what this is. This is a catastrophe. This is the destruction of everything we've worked to build in this community." Catherine began to cry, soft, broken sobs that cut through Rebecca's heart like knife blades. "Oh, Rebecca, how could you? How could you throw away everything we taught you? I love him, Mama. I thought he loved me too. He said we would be married." "Love?" William's voice rose, and Rebecca had never heard such anger from her gentle father. "You call what you did love? You've disgraced yourself, disgraced this family, disgraced the very name of Sullivan. Do you have any idea what this will do to our standing in the community? I'm a deacon, Rebecca. I lead prayers, I counsel families, I represent the moral foundation of this town. And now everyone will know that I couldn't even control my own daughter." "William, please," Catherine whispered through her tears. "She's still our child. Is she?" William turned his cold gaze back to Rebecca. "Because the daughter I raised would never have done something so shameful, so selfish. The daughter I raised understood the difference between right and wrong." Rebecca felt her own tears beginning to fall, but she forced herself to stand straight. "I made a mistake, Papa. I trusted someone I shouldn't have. But this baby is innocent, and it's your grandchild. Surely we can find a way." "Grandchild?" William's laugh was bitter and harsh. "That bastard child will never be acknowledged as a Sullivan. Never. I will not have my family name dragged through the mud because of your sins." The word bastard hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She placed her hands protectively over her stomach, as if she could shield her unborn child from the cruelty of the world it would be born into. "Where will I go?" Rebecca asked quietly. "What am I supposed to do?" "That's not my concern anymore," William replied, his voice growing colder with each word. "You made your choice when you spread your legs for that boy. Now you can live with the consequences, William." Catherine gasped, shocked by her husband's crude language. "Don't William me, Catherine. This girl has brought shame on our house, on our name, on everything we hold sacred. I won't have it. I won't have her parading around town with her belly growing bigger every day, reminding everyone that the Sullivan family raised a whore. Rebecca flinched as if she'd been slapped. The word hung in the air between them, poisonous and final. This was her father, the man who had taught her to read, who had carried her on his shoulders when she was small, who had listened to her prayers every night before bed. Now he looked at her with such disgust that she felt physically ill. I want you out of this house, William continued, his voice deadly calm. I want you packed and gone before sunrise. You are no longer welcome here, and you are no longer my daughter. Papa, please, Rebecca begged, her voice breaking. I have nowhere to go. I have no money, no family except you. Please don't do this. You should have thought of that before you decided to act like a common strumpet, William replied. Perhaps. The consequences will teach you what my years of guidance apparently failed to accomplish. Catherine stood up suddenly, her face streaked with tears. William, we can't just throw her out. She's carrying a child. She could die out there. Then perhaps she learned to make better choices in her next life, William said coldly. I will not have this family destroyed because we were too weak to do what's right. She made her bed, Catherine. Now she can lie in it. Rebecca looked from her father's set face to her mother's tear-stained cheeks, searching for any sign of hope, any indication that this nightmare might end differently. But she saw only grief and shame in her mother's eyes, and nothing but cold rejection in her father's. If that's what you want, Rebecca said quietly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, I'll go. But someday, when this baby is grown and asks about their grandparents, I'll tell them the truth. I'll tell them that their grandfather chose pride over love, and their grandmother chose silence over courage. You'll tell them nothing about us, William said firmly. As far as this family is concerned, you died tonight. We will mourn the daughter we lost, and we will never speak of what you became. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca nodded, feeling something inside her chest break irreparably. She had expected anger, disappointment, even temporary rejection. But this complete severing of all family ties was beyond anything she had imagined. Her parents weren't just throwing her out, they were erasing her from their lives entirely. She walked upstairs to her small bedroom, the room where she had spent every night of her 19 years. The familiar space looked different now, foreign somehow, as if it already belonged to someone else. She packed quickly, taking only what she could carry in her old traveling bag. A few changes of clothes, her mother's locket, a gift for her 18th birthday, the small Bible she'd received for her confirmation, and the $15 she had saved from helping Mrs. Henderson with her washing as she folded her dresses. Rebecca realized that most of them would soon be too small. Anyway, her body was changing, preparing to nurture the life growing inside her, and soon everyone would know her secret just by looking at her. The thought terrified her almost as much as the prospect of facing the world alone. She could hear her parents talking in low, urgent voices downstairs. Her mother's sobs had turned to quiet weeping, punctuated by her father's firm, angry responses. Rebecca couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. There would be no reprieve, no last-minute change of heart. When she came back downstairs with her bag, her parents were standing in the hallway waiting for her. Her mother's face was blotchy from crying, and she held a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. Some food, Catherine said quietly, not quite meeting Rebecca's eyes. Bread and cheese and some of the preserves you like. Rebecca took the bundle, noting how her mother's hands shook as she handed it over. Thank you, Mama. For a moment, she thought her mother might embrace her, might offer some word of comfort or hope. But Catherine stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself as if she needed protection from her own daughter. I'm sorry, Rebecca. Catherine whispered. "I'm so sorry." Whether she was apologizing for Rebecca's situation or for her own inability to stand up to her husband, Rebecca couldn't tell. Maybe both. William opened the front door, and the cool October air swept into the house, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter's approach. "Go," he said simply. Rebecca walked past her parents, past the threshold of the only home she had ever known, and into the darkness beyond. She heard the door close behind her with a soft but final click, followed by the sound of the bolt sliding into place. Standing in the yard where she had played as a child, Rebecca looked back at the house that had sheltered and shaped her for 19 years. Light glowed warmly in the windows, and she could see her parents moving about inside already, beginning the process of pretending she had never existed. The weight of her situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. She was alone in the world, carrying a child she couldn't support, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The nearest town was 12 miles away, and she had no idea what she would find when she got there, or how she would survive once she did. But standing there in the cold autumn air, feeling her unborn child's presence like a small steady flame inside her, Rebecca made a promise. She would survive this. She would find a way to build a life for herself and her baby, even if it meant starting from nothing. Her father had called her shameful and selfish, but she would prove him wrong. She would show the world that love could triumph over judgment, that hope could survive even the deepest betrayal. Rebecca Sullivan, though she supposed she could no longer claim that name, adjusted her grip on her traveling bag and began walking down the dirt road that led away from everything she had ever known. Behind her, the lights of her childhood home grew smaller and dimmer until they disappeared entirely into the darkness. The first chapter of her old life was over. Whatever came next, she would face it with whatever strength she could find, for herself and for the innocent life that depended on her survival. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead in the moonlight, winding through fields of harvested corn, whose dried stalks rustled like whispered warnings in the night breeze. Rebecca's feet had already begun to ache in her worn boots, and the traveling bag that had seemed so light when she packed it now felt like it was filled with stones. Each step took her further from the world she knew and deeper into an uncertain future that terrified her more with every passing minute. She had been walking for what felt like hours when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the gentle sprinkle had turned into a steady downpour that soaked through her wool cloak and chilled her to the bone. The dirt road, already rutted from wagon wheels and horse hooves, quickly turned into a treacherous mess of mud that sucked at her boots and threatened to send her sprawling with every step. Lightning split the sky overhead, followed by a crash of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the earth beneath her feet. Rebecca had always been afraid of storms, and now, alone on a deserted road with nowhere to seek shelter, the fear felt magnified tenfold. She pressed one hand to her stomach, thinking of the tiny life she carried and wondering what kind of mother she would be if she couldn't even protect herself from the weather. Through the driving rain, she spotted a dark shape looming ahead, an abandoned barn whose roof sagged dangerously but still promised some protection from the storm. Rebecca stumbled toward it, her sodden skirts clinging to her legs and making each step more difficult than the last. The barn door hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking ominously as the wind caught it. Inside, the air smelled of old hay and decay. Rain dripped steadily through holes in the roof, creating small puddles on the dirt floor. But it was dry compared to the storm outside, and Rebecca sank gratefully onto a pile of moldy straw in the corner that seemed most protected from the leaks. She pulled her wet cloak tighter around her shoulders and tried to stop shivering, but the cold seemed to have settled deep in her bones. As she sat in the darkness listening to the storm rage outside, the full reality of her situation began to sink in. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and barely enough money to last a week if she was careful. The baby growing inside her would need food, shelter, medical care, clothes, things that cost money she didn't have and couldn't earn. In her condition, what respectable employer would hire a pregnant woman with no references and no family to vouch for her character? The thought of Thomas brought a fresh wave of pain that had nothing to do with her physical discomfort. How could she have been so naive, so trusting? The signs had been there if she'd chosen to see them, the way he'd always met her in secret places, how he'd never spoken of introducing her to his family, the vague way he'd described their future together without ever mentioning specific dates or plans. She'd been so dazzled by his attention, so desperate to be loved, that she'd ignored every warning her common sense had tried to give her. Now she was paying the price for her foolishness. And worse, her innocent child would pay it too. The baby would be born without a father's name, without family, without the stability every child deserved. Rebecca had grown up secure in her parents' love, never doubting that she belonged somewhere in the world. Her child would have none of those advantages. The storm continued to rage through the night, and Rebecca dozed fitfully, waking every few minutes to the sound of thunder or the feel of rain dripping on her face. When morning finally came, gray and sullen through the broken roof, she felt worse than when she'd arrived. Her clothes were still damp, her muscles ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and the meager breakfast of bread and cheese from her mother's bundle did little to ease the hollow feeling in her stomach that she needed to reach the next town, Millfield, according to the last signpost she'd seen. From there, perhaps she could catch a stage to somewhere larger, somewhere she might disappear into the anonymity of a big city. But Millfield was still 8 miles away, and the road conditions after the storm would make the journey even more difficult. Rebecca gathered her courage and her belongings and set out again. The sun had emerged from behind the clouds, but its warmth couldn't penetrate the chill that had settled over her spirits. The road was a muddy mess, forcing her to pick her way carefully around deep puddles and treacherous ruts. Her boots, which had been perfectly adequate for walking around her family's farm, were never meant for this kind of journey. Soon they were caked with mud and letting in water with every step. By midday, she had developed painful blisters on both feet, and the cramping in her lower back had grown worse. She stopped frequently to rest, partly from exhaustion and partly because the pregnancy made her feel nauseated whenever she walked too quickly. Each time she paused, the fears would crowd back into her mind. What if she couldn't make it to town? What if she collapsed here on this lonely road? Who would find her, and what would become of her baby? It was during one of these rest stops, as she sat on a fallen log trying to ease the pain in her feet, that Rebecca heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart leaped with hope. Perhaps someone would offer her a ride, or at least point her toward the nearest shelter. But as the riders came into view, her hope turned to dread. 3 men on horseback were approaching, and even from a distance, Rebecca could see that they were rough-looking characters. Their clothes were dirty and ill-fitting, their faces unshaven, and something in their posture suggested predators who had spotted prey. Rebecca quickly stood and tried to continue walking, hoping they would simply pass by, but they reined in their horses when they reached her. "Well, well," said the largest of the 3, a man with greasy black hair and cold, calculating eyes. "What have we here?" "A pretty little thing all alone on the road." "Please," Rebecca said quietly, not stopping her forward motion. "I'm just traveling to Millfield. I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" The man laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Who said anything about trouble? We're just being neighborly, offering assistance to a lady in distress." His companions chuckled at this, and Rebecca's blood ran cold. She had heard stories about women who traveled alone, about what could happen to them when they encountered men like these. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, and she quickened her pace. "Now don't be unfriendly," the leader called, urging his horse to keep pace with her. "A young woman like you shouldn't be out here alone. All sorts of dangerous folks on these roads. You need protection." I'm fine, thank you, Rebecca said firmly, though her voice shook with fear. My husband is expecting me in town. Husband? The man's eyes swept over her with obvious skepticism. I don't see any wedding ring. And if you had a husband, what kind of man would let his wife travel alone in her condition? Rebecca's heart stopped. They had noticed. Somehow these predators had seen what she thought was still her secret. The slight thickening of her waist, the way she held herself, details that had escaped her parents, noticed but were apparently obvious to these men who made their living preying on the vulnerable. That's right, said one of the others, a thin man with a cruel smile. We can always tell. You're carrying a bastard, aren't you? Cast out by your family, nowhere to go, no one to care what happens to you. Rebecca broke into a run, her feet sliding in the mud, her heart pounding with terror. Behind her, she heard the men laughing and the sound of hoofbeats as they followed at an easy pace, clearly enjoying her fear. Her heavy skirts and the rough road conditions made escape impossible, and within moments they had surrounded her. Please, she gasped, backing toward a large oak tree. Please just leave me alone. I have nothing worth taking. All but you do, the leader said, dismounting from his horse with deliberate slowness. You have exactly what we're interested in. And who's going to stop us? Who's going to come looking for a ruined woman with no family and no prospects? Rebecca pressed herself against the tree trunk, her mind racing desperately for some way to escape. These men were right. She had no one to protect her, no one who would even know she was missing. She was completely at their mercy, and from the looks in their eyes, mercy was something they had little experience with. Just as the leader reached for her, a new sound cut through the air, the crack of a rifle being cocked. All four of them froze, and a voice called out from the woods nearby. I'd suggest you boys find somewhere else to be. An older man emerged from the tree line, his rifle trained steadily on the group of riders. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and a beard, but there was nothing frail about him. His stance was that of someone who knew how to use the weapon in his hands, and his eyes held the cold determination of a man who had seen enough of the world to know evil when he encountered it. This is none of your concern, old man, the leader snarled, but Rebecca noticed he made no move toward her while the rifle was pointed in his direction. I'm making it my concern, the stranger replied calmly. The lady asked to be left alone. I suggest you honor her request. She's a whore, one of the other men spat. Pregnant and cast out, no one's going to miss her. The rifle swung toward the speaker, and the older man's voice grew dangerously quiet. I'm going to count to 3. If you're not riding away by the time I reach 3, I'm going to start shooting. And I haven't missed a target in 40 years. For a long moment, the standoff continued. Rebecca held her breath, pressed against the tree, afraid to move lest she somehow tip the balance in the wrong direction. The tension was so thick she could almost taste it. 1, the older man said calmly. The riders exchanged glances clearly, trying to decide if the old man was bluffing. 2, the leader's hand moved toward his own gun, but the rifle immediately focused on him with deadly precision. 3, the rifle's crack split the morning air, and the bullet struck the ground directly between the leader's feet, sending up a spray of dirt and mud. The horses reared in alarm, and the men fought to control their mounts. Next one goes center mass, the old man said conversationally. Your choice. The leader cursed violently, but he remounted his horse. This isn't over, old man. And you, he pointed at Rebecca, we know what you are now. We'll be keeping an eye out for you. With that threat hanging in the air, the 3 riders spurred their horses and galloped away, leaving only the sound of retreating hoofbeats and Rebecca's labored breathing. The old man kept his rifle ready until the riders were completely out of sight, then carefully uncocked it and slung it over his shoulder. Only then did he turn his attention to Rebecca, who was still pressed against the tree, shaking with delayed shock and relief. "You all right, miss?" he asked gently, his voice completely different from the steely tone he'd used with the men. Rebecca tried to answer, but only a choked sob came out. The terror, exhaustion, and despair of the past day finally overwhelmed her, and she slid down the tree trunk to sit in the mud, crying as if her heart would break. The old man approached slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt. "Easy now," he said softly. "You're safe. They're gone, and they won't be coming back." "Thank you," Rebecca finally managed between sobs. "Thank you for saving me. I don't know what they would have done." "I know what they would have done," the man said grimly. "And I know what kind of woman travels these roads alone. The question is, what's your story? What brought you to this place?" Rebecca looked up at him through her tears, this stranger who had risked his own safety to protect her. His face was weathered and kind, and she saw no judgment in his eyes, only concern and a deep weariness that suggested he had seen too much suffering in his lifetime. "I have nowhere else to go," she said simply, and somehow those words contained the entire truth of her situation. The old man studied her for a long moment, taking in her muddy dress, her exhausted face, and the protective way she held her hands over her stomach. "What's your name, child?" "Rebecca," she whispered. "Rebecca Sullivan." "Well, Rebecca Sullivan, I'm Samuel Hayes, and I think you'd better come with me." Samuel Hayes helped Rebecca to her feet with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the deadly efficiency he'd displayed just moments before. His weathered hands were steady and warm, and when she swayed slightly from exhaustion, he caught her elbow to steady her without making her feel helpless or weak. "Can you walk a bit further?" he asked, studying her pale face with concern. "My wagon's about a quarter mile through those trees. It's not much, but it'll get you off this road and somewhere safe." Rebecca nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure her legs would support her. The encounter with the riders had drained what little strength she had left, and the baby seemed to be pressing against her ribs, making it difficult to breathe properly. But the alternative, staying on this isolated road where those men, or others like them, might return, was unthinkable. Samuel retrieved a worn leather satchel from where he'd hidden behind the trees, slinging it over his shoulder alongside his rifle. "I was hunting rabbits for supper when I heard the commotion," he explained as they began walking. "Been tracking a particularly clever cottontail for the better part of an hour. Lucky thing, as it turns out." "Lucky for me," Rebecca said quietly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." "Nothing good," Samuel replied grimly. "Those particular men have been causing trouble in these parts for months. Sheriff's been looking for them, but they're smart enough to avoid the main roads and stick to preying on folks who won't be missed." The implication of his words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She was exactly the kind of person those men targeted, isolated, vulnerable, with no one to report her disappearance. The realization of how close she'd come to disaster made her stomach churn with something beyond morning sickness. They walked in companionable silence through a grove of maple trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Under different circumstances, Rebecca might have found the scene beautiful, but now the approaching winter represented yet another threat to her survival. How could she possibly care for herself and a baby through the harsh Nebraska winter with no money and no shelter? True to his word, Samuel's wagon waited in a small clearing just beyond the trees. It was a simple farm wagon pulled by two sturdy draft horses, loaded with various supplies and what looked like the makings of a temporary camp. A bedroll was tied behind the driver's seat, along with cooking utensils and a small canvas tarp. "You live out here?" Rebecca asked, confused. The wagon suggested someone who spent considerable time traveling rather than settled in one place. Samuel's expression grew more guarded. "Something like that. I move around quite a bit these days. Haven't had a permanent home in quite some time." He helped her up onto the wagon seat, and Rebecca was grateful to finally be off her aching feet. The elevated position also gave her a better view of their surroundings, and she could see smoke rising from chimneys in the distance, the outskirts of what must be Millfield. "Where were you headed?" Samuel asked as he climbed up beside her. "And took the reins, Millfield, originally. But I'm not sure what I'll do when I get there. I don't know anyone, and She trailed off, suddenly aware that she was revealing her desperate circumstances to a complete stranger. For all his kindness, she knew nothing about Samuel Hayes beyond the fact that he'd saved her from those riders. "And you're carrying a child with no husband and no family to support you," Samuel said matter-of-factly. "It's obvious enough, child. No need to be ashamed of stating facts." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, but there was no judgment in Samuel's voice, only the same calm observation he might use to comment on the weather. "My father threw me out," she said quietly. "He's a deacon in our church, and he said I'd disgraced the family name. He told me I was no longer his daughter." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins, and she saw his jaw clench. Did he now? A man of God who throws out his own child when she needs him most. "I've met his type before." There was something bitter in his tone that made Rebecca glance at him more carefully. Lines of old pain were etched around his eyes, and she sensed that Samuel Hayes had his own complicated history with matters of faith and family. "The father of the baby?" Samuel asked after a moment. "Gone. Disappeared the moment I told him." Rebecca's voice was steady, but she felt the familiar ache of abandonment in her chest. "I thought he loved me. He promised we'd be married, but when it came time to make good on those promises—" "Men like that are cowards," Samuel said bluntly. "Real men stand by their responsibilities, especially when it comes to innocent children." "What was his name?" "Thomas Mitchell. He was apprenticed to the blacksmith in our town, but he left to go back east when I told him about the baby." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Mitchell. I'll remember that name. Men who run from their obligations have a way of running into consequences eventually." They had reached the outskirts of Millfield, a town larger than Rebecca's rural community, but still small enough that everyone would know everyone else's business within a matter of days. The main street was lined with shops and businesses, a general store, a hotel, a church with a tall white steeple, and various other establishments that catered to both locals and travelers passing through. "Not much opportunity here for a young woman in your situation," Samuel observed, as if reading her thoughts. "Small towns don't take kindly to unmarried mothers, and word would spread quickly about your circumstances." Rebecca's heart sank. She had been hoping that Millfield might offer some chance of employment, some way to support herself until the baby came. But Samuel was right. In a town this size, her condition would become common knowledge within days, and once that happened, no respectable business would hire her. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, and she hated how small and lost her voice sounded. "I have a little money, but not enough to get far, and certainly not enough to support a baby." Samuel guided the wagon through the town's main street, and Rebecca noticed how people watched them pass. She saw curious glances, speculative looks, and more than a few disapproving frowns directed her way. Even covered in mud and exhaustion, traveling with an older man she clearly didn't know, she was already the subject of whispered conversations. "There's a place," Samuel said finally, as they reached the far edge of town. "About 10 miles south of here. It's not much, just an old homestead that's been abandoned for a few years. But it has 4 walls and a roof, and it's far enough from town that folks don't bother with it much." "You mean I should live there, alone?" The thought was both appealing and terrifying. Privacy and shelter were exactly what she needed, but the isolation that would protect her from judgment would also leave her vulnerable to dangers like the men they'd encountered earlier. "Not alone," Samuel said quietly. "I've been using the place as a base camp for my travels. There's a decent barn where I keep my horses, and the house, while rough, is livable. You could stay there, at least until the baby comes and you figure out your next move." Rebecca stared at him in shock. "You're offering to let me stay with you? But you don't even know me. For all you know, I could be exactly what those men said. A woman of loose morals who brought this on herself." Samuel's expression hardened. Those men were scum who prey on the vulnerable. Their opinions aren't worth the dirt under my boots. As for your morals, I've seen enough of life to know that good people sometimes make mistakes, while truly bad. People rarely show the kind of genuine distress I see in you. He pulled the wagon to a stop near a weathered signpost that pointed toward various destinations. "But I want to be clear about something, Rebecca Sullivan. This isn't charity, and it's not because I expect anything from you in return. I'm offering you shelter because it's the right thing to do, and because I've seen what happens to women in your situation when they have nowhere to turn." "I don't understand," Rebecca said softly. "Why would you help a stranger? What's in it for you?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "I had a daughter once. Her name was Mary, and she was about your age when she found herself in a similar situation. Her young man promised to marry her, then disappeared when she told him about the baby." Rebecca's heart clenched with sympathy. "What happened to her?" "I threw her out," Samuel said simply, and the pain in his voice was raw and immediate despite what must have been years since the events he described. "I was so concerned with what the neighbors would think, so worried about my reputation in the community, that I chose pride over love. I told her she was no longer my daughter and that she could live with the consequences of her sins." The parallel to Rebecca's own situation was so exact that she felt dizzy. "And she died 3 months later, froze to death in an alley in Kansas City, along with her unborn child. I didn't even know she was dead until a traveling preacher who tried to help her found me and told me what happened." Samuel's voice broke slightly. "She died calling for me, asking why her papa didn't love her anymore." Tears streamed down Rebecca's face as she absorbed the full tragedy of Samuel's story. Here was a man who had made the same choice her father had made, who had chosen judgment over compassion, and who had lived with the devastating consequences ever since. "I can't bring Mary back," Samuel continued, his voice steadier now. "I can't undo the choice I made or take back the words I said to her. But I can make sure that another young woman in the same situation doesn't suffer the same fate. I can choose differently this time." "You're trying to save your daughter by saving me," Rebecca said quietly. "Maybe, or maybe I'm just trying to find some way to live with myself. Either way, the offer stands. You can come with me to the homestead, and you can stay as long as you need to. No expectations, no obligations beyond basic human decency." Rebecca looked at this weathered old man who had already saved her life once today and was now offering to save it again in a completely different way. The smart thing to do would be to ask more questions, to demand details about the arrangement, to protect herself from potential exploitation. But something in Samuel's eyes, the genuine remorse, the deep weariness of a man who had been carrying guilt for years, told her that his offer was exactly what it appeared to be: one damaged soul trying to help another. "The homestead," she said finally, "is it really livable? I mean, for someone who's going to have a baby?" "It needs work," Samuel admitted. "The roof leaks in a couple of places, and the wood stove will need to be cleaned and repaired before winter. But the foundation is solid, and there's a good well for water. With some effort, it could be made comfortable. And you wouldn't, that is, you wouldn't expect me to." Rebecca struggled to find a delicate way to voice her concerns about what he might want from her in return for his help. Samuel's expression grew stern. "I'm offering you shelter, not purchasing your services. You'd have your own space, your own privacy, and your own choices about everything. The only thing I'd ask is that you help with basic chores as you're able, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. Fair exchange for room and board." The arrangement sounded too good to be true, but Rebecca was too exhausted and too desperate to examine it too closely. She needed shelter, safety, and time to figure out how she was going to survive as a single mother. Samuel was offering all of those things, motivated by his own need for redemption, rather than any desire to take advantage of her vulnerability. "All right," she said quietly. "I'd like to see this homestead, and Samuel, thank you. I know this is about your daughter, but it's saving my life too." Samuel nodded and picked up the reins again. "Then let's go home." As they drove south through the Nebraska countryside, Rebecca watched the landscape change from the cultivated fields around Millfield to wilder, more isolated terrain. Rolling hills covered in prairie grass stretched to the horizon, broken by occasional groves of trees and meandering streams. It was beautiful in its own stark way, but it was also empty, the kind of place where a person could disappear entirely from the civilized world. "How long have you been traveling?" Rebecca asked as they bounced along a rutted dirt track that barely qualified as a road. 3 years, Samuel replied. "Ever since I learned what happened to Mary. I sold my farm, gave away most of my possessions, and took to the road. Been moving ever since, doing odd jobs, helping folks where I can, trying to find some kind of peace." "And have you? Found peace, I mean." Samuel considered this. "Some days are better than others. But maybe helping you will help me too. Maybe this is what I've been searching for all this time, a chance to make a different choice." As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they topped a small rise and Rebecca got her first glimpse of what would be her new home. The homestead sat in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the prairie winds by low hills on 3 sides. The house was a simple 2-story structure built of weathered wood, with a stone chimney and a front porch that sagged slightly, but still looked solid. Behind it stood a barn that appeared to be in better repair than the house, and she could see the dark circle of a well near the kitchen door. It wasn't much to look at, but after the events of the past 2 days, it looked like paradise to Rebecca. Here was shelter, privacy, and the promise of safety, everything she needed to survive until she could figure out what came next. "Welcome home," Samuel said as he guided the horses down the slope toward the house. For the first time since leaving her parents' house, Rebecca felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. She was still pregnant, still alone, still facing an uncertain future. But she was alive, she was safe, and she had found an unexpected ally in her struggle to build a life for herself and her child. As they pulled up in front of the weathered homestead, Rebecca placed her hands on her stomach and made a silent promise to the baby growing inside her. Whatever it took, whatever sacrifices she had to make, she would create a good life for both of them. This abandoned house in the middle of nowhere would be their starting point, their foundation for something better, the first chapter of her new life was about to begin. The interior of the abandoned homestead was better than Rebecca had dared hope, though it clearly needed substantial work before winter set in. The main room featured a large stone fireplace with a heavy wooden mantel, and though dust covered everything, the furniture that remained was solid and well made. A narrow staircase led to what she assumed were bedrooms on the 2nd floor, while a doorway revealed a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that would need thorough cleaning. "Previous owners left in a hurry," Samuel explained, setting Rebecca's traveling bag on a wooden table. "Bank foreclosure, from what I heard in town. They just packed what they could carry and moved on. Left behind anything too heavy to transport." Rebecca ran her fingers along the dusty surface of a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace. The wood was scratched and the cushion faded, but it was exactly the kind of chair where a woman might sit to nurse a baby or sing lullabies on quiet evenings. For the first time since learning of her pregnancy, she could actually picture herself as a mother, holding her child in a real home rather than struggling to survive on the streets. "I'll take the small room upstairs," Samuel said, misinterpreting her silence for concern about sleeping arrangements. There's a larger bedroom that would be more suitable for you, especially when the baby comes. Has a window facing east, so you'll get morning sun. Samuel, Rebecca said carefully, I need to ask you something directly. What happens when people in town start to notice that we're living together? An unmarried pregnant woman and a man with no blood relation, people will talk. Samuel's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. Let them talk. We know the truth of our arrangement, and that's what matters. Besides, I've found that people in small towns have more tolerance for unconventional situations when they're presented with practical necessities rather than romantic scandal. What do you mean? If anyone asks, you're my niece, come to help an old man maintain his property in exchange for room and board. Your husband died in a farming accident back east, and you're staying here until you figure out your next steps. Simple story, explains everything, and gives you respectable widow status instead of unwed mother. Rebecca stared at him in amazement. You've thought this through. I've had 3 years to think about what I should have done for Mary. Yes, I've thought it through. Samuel moved to examine the kitchen stove, running his hands over the iron surface. This will work once it's cleaned. Chimney looks clear from what I can see. Over the next several weeks, they fell into a routine that surprised Rebecca with its comfort and normalcy. Samuel proved to be an industrious partner who attacked the homestead's problems with methodical determination. He repaired the roof leaks, cleaned and restored the kitchen stove, and reinforced the front porch steps. Meanwhile, Rebecca focused on making the interior livable, scrubbing away months of dust and grime, airing out musty bedding, and organizing. Their limited supplies. She discovered that Samuel was an excellent cook, a skill he'd apparently learned during his years of solitary travel. He showed her how to make hearty stews from whatever vegetables and meat were available, how to bake bread in the temperamental oven, and how to preserve food for the winter months ahead. In return, Rebecca contributed her knowledge of household management, mending clothes, and the herb lore her mother had taught her for treating common ailments. The physical work was harder than anything Rebecca had done while living with her parents, but it felt purposeful in a way that her previous domestic duties never had. Every improvement they made to the homestead was an investment in her future and her child's security. When she scrubbed the kitchen floor until it gleamed, she could imagine her toddler playing on those clean boards. When she sewed curtains for the windows, she pictured teaching her child to read in the warm afternoon light. Samuel rarely spoke about his past beyond his brief revelation about Mary, but Rebecca began to piece together details about his previous life. His knowledge of farming techniques suggested he'd once worked the land extensively. His familiarity with carpentry and construction indicated years of practical experience maintaining property. Most tellingly, his occasional references to my late wife revealed that Mary hadn't been his only loss. What was she like? Rebecca asked one evening as they sat by the fireplace, she mending one of Samuel's shirts while he whittled a wooden toy that would eventually be perfect for a baby. My wife, Martha, she was the kind of woman who made everyone around her feel welcome. Could stretch a pot of soup to feed unexpected guests. Always had a kind word for folks who were struggling. She would have loved having a baby in the house again. Samuel's knife stilled for a moment. She died 2 years before Mary got into trouble. Sometimes I wonder if Martha would have handled things differently, if she could have talked sense into me. You can't know that, Rebecca said gently. And torturing yourself with what-ifs won't change what happened. Wise words from someone so young, Samuel observed. Though I suspect you've done your share of wondering about different choices. Lately, Rebecca's needle paused in its work. Every day. I wonder what would have happened if I'd been stronger, if I'd said no to Thomas, if I'd seen through his promises sooner. But then I think about this baby, and I can't regret the choices that led to its existence, even if everything else went wrong. That's the difference between you and me, Samuel said quietly. You're looking forward. trying to build something good from a difficult situation. I spent 3 years looking backward, drowning in regret. Maybe it's time I learned from your example. Their conversations became one of the things Rebecca treasured most about their unusual living arrangement. Samuel treated her as an equal, asking her opinions about everything from crop rotation to household expenses. He never condescended to her because of her age or gender, and he showed genuine interest in her thoughts and ideas. It was a level of respect she'd never experienced from any man, including her own father. As autumn deepened into early winter, Rebecca's pregnancy became more pronounced. Her dresses, let out as far as possible, could no longer disguise her condition, and she moved with the careful deliberation of a woman carrying precious cargo. Samuel showed touching concern for her comfort, bringing her extra cushions for the rocking chair, insisting she rest during the heat of the day, and taking over any chores that required heavy lifting. "You don't have to treat me like I'm made of glass," Rebecca protested one afternoon when Samuel refused to let her help move a heavy trunk. "Maybe not, but I'm not taking any chances with you or the baby," he replied firmly. "I've already failed. One pregnant woman in my care. I won't make that mistake again." The guilt in his voice made Rebecca's heart ache for him. "Samuel, Mary wasn't in your care when she died. You'd sent her away, remember? What happened to her was the result of your decision, not your failure to protect her afterward." Samuel's face went very still. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No, it's supposed to make you understand that this situation is different. You're not trying to control my choices or dictate my morals. You're offering support while respecting my independence. That's not the same thing at all." He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I hope you're right. I hope I'm doing better this time." In late November, their peaceful isolation was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Rebecca was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Samuel emerged from the barn, his rifle in hand but held casually rather than at the ready. The rider was a man in his 30s, well-dressed but travel-worn, with dark hair and nervous eyes that darted constantly around the homestead, as if cataloging everything he saw. He dismounted near the front porch but remained standing beside his horse, ready for a quick departure. "If necessary, afternoon," the stranger called. "I'm looking for information about a young woman. Wondering if you folks might have seen her." Rebecca felt her blood turn to ice. She stepped behind the hanging sheets, trying to make herself invisible while still being able to hear the conversation. "Information's a broad category," Samuel replied carefully. "What kind of information, and about what young woman?" "Names. Rebecca Sullivan. About 19 years old, light brown hair, pretty enough in a country sort of way. She'd be expecting a child by now, probably showing fairly obviously." Samuel's expression didn't change, but Rebecca saw his grip shift slightly. "On the rifle." "And you are?" "Thomas Mitchell. I'm the father of the child she's carrying." Rebecca's hands flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Thomas had found her. Somehow he'd tracked her to this remote homestead, and now everything she'd worked to build over the past months was in jeopardy. "That so?" Samuel's voice was conversational, but Rebecca could hear the underlying steel. "And what's your business with this woman? Assuming someone here had seen her." "I've come to do right by her," Thomas said, his voice taking on what Rebecca recognized as his most persuasive tone. "I was confused when she first told me about the baby. Young and scared, you understand. But I've had time to think it over, and I want to marry her, give the child my name." Rebecca felt sick listening to him. Even now, faced with the consequences of his abandonment, Thomas was making excuses, portraying himself as the victim of confusion rather than the coward who had fled responsibility at the first opportunity. "Interesting," Samuel mused. "What makes you think this Rebecca person would want to marry you? Seems to me that if a man runs off when a woman needs him most, she might not be too eager to trust him again." Thomas's expression hardened slightly. That's between me and Rebecca. The point is, I'm here now, ready to do my duty. If you've seen her, if you know where she is, you'd be doing the Christian thing by telling me. The Christian thing, Samuel repeated slowly. Yes, I suppose there are different ways to interpret Christian duty. Some might say the Christian thing would have been not abandoning a pregnant woman in the first place. I made a mistake, Thomas admitted, though Rebecca could hear the irritation creeping into his voice. But I'm trying to make it right. Surely that counts for something. Rebecca pressed herself against the side of the house, her mind racing. Part of her, the part that still remembered loving Thomas, that had dreamed of their future together, whispered that this was what she'd hoped for. He'd come back, he wanted to marry her. He would give her child a father, and her a respectable place in society. But a larger part of her, the part that had grown stronger during her months at the homestead, recognized something calculating in Thomas's sudden change of heart. Men like Thomas didn't experience miraculous conversions of conscience. They acted when it served their interests, and Rebecca couldn't imagine what interest marrying her could possibly serve. Tell me something, Samuel said conversationally. What brings you out this way? This isn't exactly a well-traveled road, and you seem to know specifically that this Rebecca might be in this area. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. I have been asking around. Following leads. Someone in Millfield mentioned seeing a pregnant woman traveling with an older man a few months back. And that led you here? I've been checking every homestead, every farm, every place someone might take in a woman in trouble. Thomas's voice grew more insistent. Look, I just want to find her and make this right. If you know anything at all. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Rebecca held her breath, wondering what he would say. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. I haven't seen any young woman matching that description. And if I had, I'm not sure I'd be inclined to help a man who abandoned her when she needed him most find her. Again, seems to me that kind of man might not have her best interests at heart, regardless of what he claims. Thomas's face flushed with anger. You have no right to make that judgment. She's carrying my child, which gives me certain rights. Rights? Samuel's voice cut through Thomas's protest like a blade. What rights exactly do you think you have to a woman you abandoned? What rights to a child you refuse to acknowledge? Legal rights, Thomas snapped. The law recognizes a father's claim to his children, legitimate or not, and Rebecca ... Well, let's just say that a woman in her position doesn't have many options. Marriage to the father of her child is the only respectable solution. There it was, the threat hidden beneath Thomas's supposed generosity. He wasn't offering marriage out of love or genuine remorse. He was leveraging Rebecca's vulnerable position, using society's judgment of unmarried mothers as a weapon to force her compliance. Samuel must have heard the same thing, because his stance shifted subtly, the rifle moving from casual hold to ready position. I think this conversation is over, Mr. Mitchell. I suggest you move along. If you're hiding her, Thomas began. I'm not hiding anyone, Samuel interrupted. But if I were, and if I were protecting a woman from a man who clearly sees her desperation as an opportunity to be exploited, I'd consider that my Christian duty as well. Thomas stared at Samuel for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether to push the confrontation further. Finally, he remounted his horse, but his parting words carried a clear threat. This isn't over. I have legal rights, and I intend to exercise them. If Rebecca Sullivan is in this area, I'll find her eventually. And when I do, she'll discover that her options are much more limited than she might think. With that, Thomas spurred his horse and rode away, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats behind. Rebecca waited until the sound had completely faded before emerging from behind the house. Samuel was still standing where Thomas had left him, his rifle held ready, his face grim with thought. He'll be back, Rebecca said quietly. Probably, Samuel agreed. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Rebecca placed her hands on her swollen belly, feeling the baby's movements beneath her palms. Thomas had offered her respectability, security, a solution to all her practical problems. But he'd also made it clear that he saw her desperation as leverage, her vulnerability as something to be exploited rather than protected. I don't want to marry him, she said firmly. I don't love him anymore, and I don't trust him. But Samuel, what if he really does have legal rights? What if he can force me to marry him or take the baby away? Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. Law is a complicated thing, especially out here where it's not always clear which jurisdiction applies. But I know someone who might have answers. A lawyer named James Crawford, who practices in the territorial capital. Good man. Fights for folks who don't have much power otherwise. And you think he'd help us? I think he'd help you, Samuel corrected. And I think it's time we found out exactly what your rights are in this situation. Because whatever Thomas Mitchell thinks he's entitled to, I have a feeling you have more power than he wants you to believe. As they walked back toward the house, together, Rebecca felt a familiar stirring of hope mixed with determination. Thomas had found her, had threatened her, had tried to use her desperation against her. But he'd also revealed his true nature, stripping away any romantic illusions she might still have harbored about their past. Relationship. She was no longer the naive girl who had trusted in pretty promises and vague assurances. She was a woman who had survived abandonment, homelessness, and the very real threat of violence. She had learned to work with her hands, to make hard decisions, to depend on her own strength rather than the unreliable protection of men who saw her only as a means to their own ends. Thomas Mitchell wanted to claim her and her child as his property, to use the law and social convention to force her into a marriage that would serve his purposes rather than her needs. But Rebecca Sullivan, or whatever name she chose to claim, was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a woman with allies, with options, and with the fierce determination of a mother protecting her unborn child. Whatever battle Thomas wanted to wage, she would be ready for it. 3 days after Thomas's threatening visit, Rebecca woke to the sound of multiple horses approaching the homestead. Through her bedroom window, she could see 4 riders in the early morning. Miss Thomas, accompanied by 2 men she didn't recognize and someone who made her blood run cold with recognition. Her father, William Sullivan, sat rigid in his saddle, his face set in the same expression of righteous judgment. She remembered from that terrible night when he'd thrown her out. Rebecca's hands trembled as she dressed quickly, her mind racing with the implications. Thomas hadn't just returned. He'd brought reinforcements, including the one person whose authority she'd been conditioned from birth to respect and fear. Whatever legal rights Thomas claimed to have, he was clearly prepared to use every weapon at his disposal to force her compliance. Downstairs, she found Samuel already dressed and armed, peering through the curtains at the approaching group. His expression was grim but unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting this confrontation. "Your father?" he asked quietly as Rebecca joined him at the window. "Yes, I don't know how Thomas found him, or what he told him, but ... Rebecca's voice trailed off as she watched her father's stern profile. Even from a distance, she could see the disapproval radiating from his rigid posture. "He told him whatever would bring him here," Samuel said flatly. "Men like Thomas are skilled at finding other people's weaknesses and exploiting them. Your father's pride, his concern for family reputation, Thomas would have known exactly which buttons to push." The riders pulled up in front of the house, and Thomas dismounted with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. The 2 strangers remained mounted, their hands resting conspicuously near their weapons-hired men. Rebecca realized, brought along to ensure compliance through intimidation if persuasion failed. William Sullivan climbed down from his horse. with the deliberate movements of a man who viewed this entire situation as deeply distasteful but necessary. He stood beside Thomas, but Rebecca noticed he kept a careful distance, as if even association with the younger man left him feeling soiled. "Rebecca Sullivan," Thomas called toward the house, his voice carrying false warmth layered over unmistakable command. "I know you're in there. Your father and I have come to discuss your future and the future of your child. It's time to stop hiding and face your responsibilities." Samuel moved toward the door, but Rebecca caught his arm. "Let me handle this. They're here for me, and running from this conversation won't make it go away. You don't have to face them alone," Samuel said firmly. "Whatever they think they can demand from you, remember that you have choices. You're not the powerless girl you were 6 months ago." Rebecca nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. She opened the door and stepped onto the front porch. Samuel closed behind her. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and her breath formed small clouds as she looked down at the men who had come to decide her fate. "Hello, Papa," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thomas." William's eyes swept over her with obvious distaste, taking in her enlarged belly, her simple work dress, and the comfortable familiarity with which she stood beside Samuel. "Rebecca, you look—" He struggled for words that wouldn't be outright. "Cruel. You look well enough, considering your circumstances." "Thank you," Rebecca replied dryly. "Though I suspect you didn't ride all this way to inquire about my health." Thomas stepped forward, assuming the role of spokesman for the group. "Rebecca, we need to talk. About the baby, about your future, about what's best for everyone involved. This situation has gone on long enough." "What situation would that be?" Rebecca asked, though she knew perfectly well what he meant. She wanted to hear him say it, wanted to force him to articulate exactly what he thought gave him the right to make demands. "You're carrying my child," Thomas said bluntly. "That child deserves a father's name and a mother who isn't living in sin with a man she's not married to." The accusation hit the morning air like a physical slap. Rebecca felt Samuel tense beside her, but he remained silent, allowing her to fight this battle on her own terms. "Living in sin?" Rebecca repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Is that what you think is happening here? What else would you call it?" William spoke for the first time, his voice heavy with disappointment and disgust. "An unmarried woman, pregnant with a bastard child, living alone with a man who's not her husband. If that's not sin, then the Bible means nothing." Rebecca felt the familiar ache of her father's rejection, but it was tempered now by anger and a hard-won understanding of her own worth. "The Bible also has things to say about men who abandon pregnant women, Papa, and about fathers who turn their backs on their children in their time of greatest need." William's face darkened. "Don't quote scripture to me, girl. You forfeited any right to moral guidance when you spread your legs for this boy and brought shame on our family name." The crude words hit Rebecca like physical blows, but she forced herself to stand straight. "And yet here you are, standing beside the very man who abandoned me when I needed him most. Interesting how your moral standards seem to shift depending on who's asking for your support." "Thomas has explained the situation," William said stiffly. He was young and scared, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what happened. "But he's here, now ready to do his duty and make an honest woman of you." "His duty," Rebecca repeated slowly. "And what about my choice in the matter? What about what I want?" Thomas laughed, the sound devoid of any real humor. "What you want, Rebecca, let's be realistic about your situation. You're an unmarried mother living with a man who's not your husband, in a house that doesn't belong to you, with no money and no prospects. What you want is a luxury you can't afford." "I have prospects," Rebecca said firmly. "I have skills, I have options, and I have people who care about my well-being rather than just their own convenience." "Options?" One of the hired men spoke for the first time, his voice rough with barely concealed threat. What kind of options does a whore with a bastard child think she has? The word hung in the morning air like a curse, and Rebecca saw Samuel's hand move toward his rifle. But before he could act, she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension with surprising authority. "I think this conversation has revealed more about all of you than it has about me," she said clearly. "Thomas, you disappeared the moment I told you about the baby. You didn't write, didn't send word, didn't care whether I lived or died. Now you show up with hired guns and my father, demanding that I marry you not out of love or genuine remorse, but because it's convenient. For you, I'm offering you respectability," Thomas protested. "Marriage to the father of your child. Most women in your position would be grateful for the chance." "Grateful?" Rebecca's voice rose slightly. "Grateful to marry a man who sees my desperation as an opportunity to be exploited. Grateful to tie myself for life to someone who abandoned me when I needed him most and only came back when it served his purposes." "What purposes?" Thomas demanded. "What could I possibly gain from marrying you?" Rebecca had been wondering the same thing, but looking at the defensive anger in Thomas's eyes, she suddenly understood. "You're in trouble, aren't you? Something happened after you left, something that makes marriage to a respectable woman necessary. For your own survival." Thomas's face went pale, confirming her suspicions. "That's ridiculous." "I'm here because you need a wife," Rebecca continued, the pieces falling into place. "Someone whose family has standing in the community. Someone whose marriage to you would provide respectability you can't achieve on your own." "What did you do, Thomas? What kind of trouble are you running from?" The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas exchanged glances with the hired men, and Rebecca saw something like panic flicker across his features. "It doesn't matter what my reasons are," he said finally. "What matters is that I'm offering you a solution to your problems. Marriage, legitimacy for your child, a father's protection. Turn me down, and what do you have? This old man who'll tire of supporting you eventually. This falling down house that doesn't even belong to you." "I have my self-respect," Rebecca said quietly. "I have people who care about me for who I am, not for what I can do for them. And I have the right to choose my own future rather than having it dictated by men who see me only as a means to their own ends." William stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Enough of this nonsense. Rebecca, you will marry Thomas Mitchell, and you will do it immediately. I won't have the Sullivan name dragged through the mud any longer by your stubborn pride." "The Sullivan name?" Rebecca laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. "Papa, you disowned me, remember? You told me I was no longer your daughter, that I was dead to you. You can't claim concern for the family name now when it's convenient for you." That was said in anger," William said stiffly, "in the heat of the moment. But blood is blood, and I won't have my grandchild born a bastard when there's a simple solution available." "Your grandchild?" Rebecca's voice was very quiet now, very dangerous. "This is the first time you've acknowledged any relationship to this baby. The first time you've shown any concern for its welfare, rather than just how its existence affects your reputation." "I'm here now," William said defensively. "I'm trying to do what's right." "What's right for who?" Rebecca demanded. "For me? For my child? Or for your standing in the community and Thomas's mysterious need for respectability?" Samuel finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "I think the lady has made her position clear. She's not interested in your offer, and she's not obligated to accept it regardless of what you think her situation requires." Thomas turned on him with obvious relief at having a new target for his anger. "And who exactly are you to interfere? In family matters? What's your interest in keeping Rebecca from making the sensible choice?" "My interest," Samuel said carefully, "is in protecting a woman who's been through enough hardship without being pressured into a marriage she doesn't want by men who clearly don't have her best interests at heart. Protecting her? One of the hired men laughed crudely. That's what you call it. Living with a pregnant woman who's not your wife. That's exactly what I call it, Samuel replied, his voice growing harder. And if you have something more specific to say, I suggest you say it plainly instead of hiding behind innuendo. The tension ratcheted up another notch as the hired men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. But before anyone could escalate to violence, Rebecca stepped forward again. "Stop," she said firmly. "All of you just stop. This isn't about Samuel, and it's not about anyone's interpretation of our living arrangements. This is about my choice, my future, and my child's welfare." She turned to face Thomas directly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. "Thomas Mitchell, I will not marry you. Not now, not ever. You abandoned me when I needed you most, and nothing you've done since then has shown me any reason to trust you with my future or my child's." Thomas's face went white with rage. "You'll regret this decision, Rebecca. You have no idea what you're turning down, or what the alternatives are going to cost you. And you have no idea what I've already survived," Rebecca replied calmly. "I've been thrown out by my family, threatened by dangerous men, left to fend for myself while pregnant and alone. I've learned that I'm stronger than I ever knew, and that I don't need to settle for men who see my vulnerability as an opportunity." She turned to her father, and for a moment, her composure wavered. Despite everything, he was still the man who had raised her, who had taught her to read and write, who had carried her on his shoulders when she was small. "Papa," she said softly, "I hope that seeing me again, seeing that I've survived and built something for myself, might change your mind about me. I hope that the prospect of a grandchild might soften your heart, make you remember that you once loved me." William's face worked with emotion, and for a moment, Rebecca thought she saw a flicker of the father she remembered. But then his expression hardened again, and she knew that his pride was stronger than his love. "If you marry Thomas, you can come home," he said stiffly. "The past can be forgotten, and you can take your rightful place in the family again. But if you persist in this stubborn defiance, if you continue to live in sin and bear a child in shame, then you are no daughter of mine." The ultimatum hung between them, final and irreversible. Rebecca felt the last of her childhood hopes dying, but surprisingly, the pain was less than she'd expected. She'd been grieving the loss of her father's love for months already. This just made it official. "Then I guess I'm no daughter of yours," she said quietly. "Because I won't marry a man I don't love to satisfy your sense of propriety. And I won't sacrifice my future and my child's welfare to protect your reputation in the community." Thomas stepped forward aggressively. "This isn't over, Rebecca. There are laws about children born out of wedlock, laws about fathers' rights. You can refuse to marry me, but you can't prevent me from claiming what's mine." "We'll see about that," Samuel said quietly, but his words carried the weight of promise and threat combined. The standoff stretched for another long moment before Thomas jerked his head toward his companions. "Mount up. We're done here for now." As the four men prepared to leave, William paused beside his horse. "Rebecca," he called, and she heard something like regret in his voice. "When you come to your senses, when you realize what you've thrown away, don't expect to find the door open. Some choices can't be undone." "I know, Papa," Rebecca replied softly. "I'm counting on it." She watched them ride away until they disappeared into the morning mist, then turned to find Samuel studying her with something like amazement. "How do you feel?" he asked gently. Rebecca considered the question seriously. She just definitively rejected her father's conditional love, turned down marriage to the father of her child, and chosen an uncertain future over guaranteed respectability. By all conventional standards, she'd made a terrible mistake. "I feel free," she said with surprise. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free." Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Then you made the right choice, regardless of what anyone else thinks. As they walked back toward the house together, Rebecca felt the baby move within her strong, determined kicks that seemed to echo her own newfound resolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever threats Thomas might carry out, she would face them as herself rather than as someone else's idea of who she should be. The girl who had once been thrown out for being pregnant was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had chosen her own path, claimed her own power, and refused to let fear dictate her future. The real test of that choice was just beginning. 2 weeks after the confrontation with Thomas and her father, Rebecca stood in the kitchen of the homestead, carefully measuring herbs into small cloth packets. The morning light streamed through windows she had cleaned until they sparkled, illuminating the organized rows of dried plants hanging from the rafters: chamomile for calming tea, willow bark for pain relief, ginger root for nausea, and dozens of others she had gathered and prepared throughout the autumn months. Word had spread through the surrounding farms about the widow woman living at the old Henderson place who had knowledge of herbal remedies. It had started when Samuel mentioned to a neighbor that Rebecca had successfully treated his persistent cough with a combination of honey, thyme, and elderberry. Soon, other families began making the journey to their isolated homestead, seeking help for ailments that were too minor for the doctor in Millfield, but troublesome enough to warrant attention. Rebecca discovered that helping others gave her a sense of purpose that went far beyond mere survival. Each successful treatment, each grateful family, reinforced her growing confidence in her own abilities and value. She wasn't just a fallen woman hiding from society's judgment. She was becoming a valued member of the community, someone people sought out for her skills rather than someone they whispered about behind closed doors. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same isolation meant to protect her from gossip had allowed her to build a reputation based entirely on her abilities, rather than her circumstances. The farmers and their wives who came seeking her help cared more about whether she could ease their children's fevers or treat their husbands' injuries than about the absence of a wedding ring on her finger. "Mrs. Patterson will be here soon," Samuel announced, entering the kitchen with an armload of firewood. The November air was growing increasingly sharp, and maintaining warmth in the old house required constant attention to the fires. Her youngest has been fighting that cough for 2 weeks now, and nothing else has helped. Rebecca nodded, adding the packet of herbs she'd been preparing to a wooden box that contained her growing pharmacopoeia. "The honey and ginger mixture should help, but if it's moved to his chest, he might need something stronger. I've been reading about steam treatments in that medical book you found." Samuel had surprised her the previous week by returning from a trip to town with an actual medical textbook purchased from a traveling merchant who claimed it had belonged to a doctor's widow. The book was old, and some of the treatments described seemed questionable, but it contained valuable information about anatomy, common illnesses, and herbal preparations that complemented the folk knowledge Rebecca had learned from her mother. "Speaking of that book," Samuel said carefully, "I had an interesting conversation in town yesterday. Dr. Henley from Millfield has been hearing about your work with the local families." Rebecca's hands stilled on the herb packets. "What kind of conversation?" "The good kind, surprisingly. He's getting older, finding it harder to make trips to the outlying farms for minor ailments. He asked if I thought you might be interested in working with him, officially learning more formal medical techniques in exchange for handling some of his rural patients." The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. Official medical training had been a dream Rebecca had never dared voice, even to herself. Women could become nurses or midwives with proper training, and the frontier's desperate need for medical care had created opportunities that might not exist in more established regions. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "That I'd ask you about it. But Rebecca, this could be exactly what you need: legitimate work that would support you and the baby, training that would give you valuable skills, and most importantly, a respected position in the community that would make it much harder for Thomas to challenge your fitness as a mother. Before Rebecca could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mrs. Patterson's familiar wagon, but there were two other riders accompanying her men she didn't recognize, whose presence immediately put her on alert. Samuel noticed her tension and moved casually toward the corner where he kept his rifle. Over the months of their partnership, they had developed an unspoken system of communication about potential threats, and both of them had learned to trust. Their instincts about visitors. Mrs. Patterson climbed down from her wagon with her usual brisk efficiency, but Rebecca noticed the worried lines around her eyes as she approached the house. The two riders remained mounted, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, but something about their posture suggested they were more than casual escorts. "Mrs. Sullivan," Mrs. Patterson called, using the name Rebecca had chosen for herself after rejecting her father's authority. "I've brought little Johnny for that cough remedy, but I'm afraid we have some other business to discuss as well." Rebecca opened the door, noting how Mrs. Patterson's gaze darted nervously toward the mounted men. "Of course. Bring Johnny in where it's warm, and we'll see what we can do for him." As Mrs. Patterson ushered her 6-year-old son into the kitchen, one of the riders dismounted and approached the porch. He was a thin, sharp-faced man in his 40s, dressed in the dark suit and formal manner of someone accustomed to wielding official authority. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated politeness, "I'm Judge Harrison from the Territorial Court. I believe you know why I'm here." Rebecca's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm afraid I don't, Judge Harrison. Perhaps you could enlighten me. I've received a petition from Mr. Thomas Mitchell regarding the custody of an unborn child he claims you're carrying. He's expressed concerns about the welfare of this child, given your unconventional living arrangements." So Thomas had made good on his threats. Rebecca felt the baby move restlessly within her, as if sensing the danger that now surrounded them both. "I see. And what exactly does this petition request?" "Mr. Mitchell is asking the court to order you to place the child in his custody immediately upon birth, pending a determination of your fitness as a mother. He's also requesting that you be compelled to marry him for the child's welfare, or, alternatively, that you be confined to a suitable institution until the birth can be safely supervised." The words hit Rebecca like physical blows. Thomas wasn't just trying to force her into marriage. He was attempting to use the legal system to take her child away entirely if she continued to refuse him. "That's outrageous," Samuel said from behind her, his voice tight with controlled anger. What possible grounds could he have for such a request? Judge Harrison consulted a document he pulled from his coat pocket. "Mr. Mitchell alleges that Mrs. Sullivan is living in an immoral relationship with a man not her husband, that she has no stable means of support, and that her refusal to marry the child's father demonstrates a reckless disregard for the child's welfare and legitimate interests." "And you're here to serve some kind of order?" Rebecca asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm here to inform you that a hearing has been scheduled for next month to consider Mr. Mitchell's petition. You'll be required to appear and respond to these allegations." The judge's tone suggested he found the entire situation distasteful, but was bound by legal obligation to proceed. Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening with growing alarm while trying to comfort her coughing son, suddenly stepped forward. "Judge Harrison, if I may say something about Mrs. Sullivan's character and fitness as a caregiver." The judge looked surprised by the interruption, but nodded for her to continue. "This woman has treated half the families in this county over the past few months," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "She's helped children with fevers, women with difficult pregnancies, men with injuries from farm work. She's skilled, knowledgeable, and more dedicated to helping others than most people I know. The idea that she's unfit to care for her own child is absurd." "That's very touching, Mrs. Patterson," Judge Harrison replied dryly. But the court must consider the legal and moral standards that govern child welfare, not just personal testimonials. About medical skills, what legal standards? Samuel interjected. What law says a woman can't raise her own child simply because she chooses not to marry a man who abandoned her? The law recognizes fathers' rights, the judge replied stiffly. And it takes a dim view of children born into irregular circumstances. When regular arrangements are available. Rebecca listened to this exchange with growing anger and determination. These men were discussing her child, her future, her very right to motherhood, as if she were merely an obstacle to be overcome rather than a person with agency and rights of her own. Judge Harrison, she said clearly, interrupting the debate. I understand that I'm required to appear at this hearing. What I don't understand is why Mr. Mitchell's claims are being given credence when he's provided no evidence of unfitness beyond his disapproval of my personal choices. He's provided evidence of irregular moral conduct and unstable living conditions. The judge replied, in matters involving child welfare, the court errs on the side of caution. Caution? Rebecca's voice rose slightly. What's cautious about removing a child from its mother and giving it to a man who abandoned both of them? What's stable about forcing a woman into marriage with someone she doesn't trust? Mrs. Patterson nodded vigorously in agreement. Judge, I've known Mrs. Sullivan for months now, and I've never seen anything but the highest moral character. As for her living arrangements with Mr. Hayes, they've been completely proper. He's been a gentleman and a protector, nothing more. The appearances suggest otherwise, the judge said firmly. An unmarried pregnant woman living alone with a man creates implications that the court cannot ignore, regardless of the actual facts. Rebecca felt a flash of inspiration. Judge Harrison, you mentioned that the court is concerned with moral standards and regular arrangements. What if I could demonstrate that my living situation is both moral and regular according to established social conventions? The judge looked puzzled. I'm not sure what you mean. Rebecca took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would change everything, but seeing no alternative that would protect her child. What if Mr. Hayes and I were married? Would that satisfy the court's concerns about irregular arrangements? The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel stared at her in shock. Mrs. Patterson looked surprised but pleased, and Judge Harrison appeared to be rapidly recalculating the legal implications of her suggestion. You're proposing marriage to Mr. Hayes? The judge asked carefully. I'm proposing a solution that addresses every concern in Mr. Mitchell's petition, Rebecca replied. Marriage would provide stability, respectability, and a father figure for the child. It would eliminate any questions about irregular moral conduct, and it would give my child the protection of a two-parent household. Samuel found his voice. Rebecca, you don't have to. Yes, I do, she interrupted gently. Samuel, you've protected me and cared for me when no one else would. You've treated me with respect and kindness, and you've shown me what a real partnership can look like. If you're willing, I think we could build something good together. But what about love? Mrs. Patterson asked softly. Marriage should be about more than legal convenience. Rebecca looked at Samuel, this weathered man who had saved her life, given her shelter, and shown her more genuine care than any other man she'd known. Love comes in many forms, she said quietly. I may not feel for Samuel the kind of passionate love I once thought I felt for Thomas, but I care for him deeply, I trust him completely, and I respect him more than any man I've ever known. That seems like a better foundation for marriage than pretty promises and false charm. Samuel stepped closer to her, his weathered face soft with emotion. Rebecca, are you sure? Marriage is a serious commitment, and you shouldn't feel pressured into it just to protect yourself from Thomas's legal threats. I'm not being pressured. Rebecca said firmly, I'm making a choice. I'm choosing a man who has proven his worth through actions rather than words, who has shown me respect when I was vulnerable, and who has demonstrated the kind of character I want my child to learn from. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, clearly eager to resolve a situation that had become more complicated than anticipated. If you were to marry Mr. Hayes, it would indeed address the concerns raised in Mr. Mitchell's petition. A married woman with a stable household would have a much stronger position in any custody dispute. Then let's do it, Rebecca said decisively. Samuel, will you marry me? Samuel's eyes filled with tears as he took her hands in his calloused ones. Rebecca Sullivan, it would be the greatest honor of my life to be your husband and to raise your child as my own. Mrs. Patterson burst into tears of joy, her son looking up at the adults with confusion, but sensing that something momentous was happening. Judge Harrison actually smiled for the first time since his arrival. Well, he said, this certainly changes the legal landscape considerably. If you're serious about this, I can perform the ceremony right now. I'm authorized to conduct marriages as part of my judicial duties. Right now? Rebecca asked, suddenly aware that she was about to marry a man while wearing a work dress and standing in a kitchen that smelled of herbs and wood smoke. No time like the present, Mrs. Patterson declared, wiping her eyes. And it would certainly put an end to Mr. Mitchell's legal nonsense once and for all. Rebecca looked around the simple kitchen that had become her sanctuary, at the man who had given her hope when she thought it was lost, at the kind neighbor who had become an advocate and friend. This wasn't the wedding she had once dreamed of, but it was real, honest, and based on mutual respect rather than romantic illusion. Yes, she said firmly. Let's do it right now. As Judge Harrison began the brief ceremony that would bind her life to Samuel's, Rebecca felt the baby kick vigorously, as if celebrating this new turn of events. In less than an hour, she had gone from facing the loss of her child to gaining a husband, a protector, and a future she had never dared imagine. The frightened girl who had been thrown out for being pregnant was becoming Mrs. Samuel Hayes, a respected member of the community with legal standing, medical skills, and most importantly, the power to protect her child from those who would use its existence against her. Thomas Mitchell had tried to use the law as a weapon. Instead, he had forced Rebecca to claim a position of strength she might never have reached on her own. As Samuel kissed her to seal their vows, Rebecca smiled with genuine happiness for the first time in months. Her child would be born into a family built on respect, partnership, and unshakable commitment to doing what was right rather than what was easy. The battle for her future was far from over, but she was no longer fighting it alone. 5 years had passed since that snowy December morning when Rebecca Hayes had given birth to her daughter in the bedroom of the old homestead, with Samuel holding her hand and Dr. Henley guiding the baby safely into the world. Now as she stood in the doorway of what had once been an abandoned house and watched her daughter Emma chase chickens around the yard while chattering to Samuel about everything she observed, Rebecca marveled at how completely her life had transformed. Homestead itself was barely recognizable from the run-down property she and Samuel had first made habitable. What had once been a refuge had become a thriving farm and medical practice. Samuel had expanded the house, adding a proper clinic room where Rebecca could treat patients in comfort and privacy. The barn had been rebuilt and expanded to house not only their livestock but also the herbs and medical supplies that formed the backbone of Rebecca's growing practice. Most remarkably, their isolated location had become a destination rather than a hiding place. A worn but well-maintained road now connected the homestead to Millfield and the surrounding farming communities, traveled regularly by families seeking medical care, expectant mothers wanting Rebecca's assistance with their pregnancies, and neighbors who had come to see the Hayes farm as the unofficial medical center for the entire region. "Mama, Mr. Samuel says the new calf was born this morning, and I can name her if I think of something good," Emma announced, running up to the porch with the boundless energy of a healthy 5-year-old. Her dark hair caught the morning sunlight. and her bright blue eyes sparkled with the confidence of a child who had never doubted her place in the world. "That's a big responsibility," Rebecca replied seriously, settling into the rocking chair on the front porch. "What kind of name do you think would suit a baby calf?" Emma considered this with the intense concentration that children brought to important decisions. Something pretty, but also strong. "Like you, Mama." Rebecca felt the familiar catch in her throat that came whenever Emma unknowingly demonstrated the security and self-assurance that Rebecca had fought so hard to provide. This little girl would never know what it felt like to be unwanted, abandoned, or ashamed of her existence. She would grow up understanding that she was loved unconditionally, valued for who she was rather than what others expected her to be. "Speaking of strong," Samuel called from the barn, where he was finishing the morning chores, "we've got visitors coming up the road. Looks like Dr. Henley's buggy, and he's got someone with him." Rebecca shaded her eyes against the morning sun, and could indeed see the familiar shape of the doctor's vehicle approaching, accompanied by a second buggy she didn't recognize. Visitors were common enough, but Dr. Henley usually sent word ahead when he planned to bring colleagues or patients to the homestead. As the vehicles drew closer, Rebecca could see that Dr. Henley's passenger was a woman, well-dressed and carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to professional respect. The second buggy held two men in formal city clothing, one of whom was taking notes as he observed the homestead's prosperous appearance. "Mrs. Hayes," Dr. Henley called as he climbed down from his buggy. "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit, but I have some folks here who've been very eager to meet you." The woman with Dr. Henley approached with an extended hand and a warm smile. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing as they took in Rebecca's confident bearing and the well-organized medical supplies visible through the clinic room's open door. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm Dr. Margaret Foster from the Colorado Medical College. Dr. Henley has been telling me remarkable things about your work here, and I wanted to see for myself the operation you've built." Rebecca felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with pride. The Colorado Medical College was one of the few institutions in the territory that trained women as physicians, and Dr. Foster's reputation as a pioneering female doctor had reached even their remote corner of Nebraska. "Dr. Foster, what an honor," Rebecca replied, accepting the handshake. "Though I'm afraid Dr. Henley may have exaggerated my accomplishments. I'm largely self-taught, working from books and experience rather than formal training." "Self-taught," Dr. Foster repeated thoughtfully. "Dr. Henley tells me you've successfully delivered over 60 babies in the past 4 years, treated everything from broken bones to epidemic fevers, and developed several innovative herbal treatments that he's now using in his own practice. That hardly sounds like amateur work to me." One of the men from the second buggy approached them, removing his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm James Crawford, a lawyer from the territorial capital. Dr. Foster asked me to accompany her today because we have a proposition that involves both medical and legal considerations." Rebecca felt Samuel moving to stand beside her, his presence offering silent support as it had for the past 5 years. Emma, sensing that important adult business was being conducted, had quietly moved to lean against Samuel's leg while continuing to observe everything with bright curiosity. "What kind of proposition?" Rebecca asked carefully. Dr. Foster gestured toward the clinic room. "May we see your facilities? I'd like to understand the scope of what you've accomplished here before we discuss our proposal." For the next hour, Rebecca found herself giving an impromptu tour of the medical practice she and Samuel had built together. She showed them the clinic room with its examination table, surgical instruments, and carefully organized supplies. She explained her herb garden, where she grew medicinal plants that couldn't be gathered wild. She demonstrated the sterilization techniques she'd learned from medical texts and adapted for frontier conditions. Most impressively, she presented her detailed patient records, 5 years' worth of meticulous notes documenting symptoms, treatments, outcomes, and follow-up care. It was the kind of thorough documentation that many formally trained physicians failed to maintain. "Extraordinary," Dr. Foster murmured, paging through one of the record books. "Mrs. Hayes, you've essentially created a comprehensive rural medical practice from nothing. Your success rate with difficult births is better than most city hospitals, and your innovative use of local plants for medical treatment represents exactly the kind of practical knowledge we need to document and preserve." What Dr. Foster is trying to say, Mr. Crawford interjected with a smile, is that we'd like to offer you an opportunity to formalize your medical education and expand your practice beyond this single location. Rebecca looked from one visitor to another, trying to understand what they were proposing. "I'm not sure I follow." Dr. Foster leaned forward eagerly. "The territorial government has approved funding for a network of rural medical clinics staffed by practitioners with both formal training and practical frontier experience. We want you to lead this program. Mrs. Hayes, you would spend 6 months at the Colorado Medical College, completing intensive training in advanced surgical techniques and modern medical practices, then return here to establish your homestead as the headquarters for medical services throughout this region." The proposal was so far beyond anything Rebecca had imagined that she felt momentarily dizzy. "You want me to attend medical college? To become a real doctor?" "You're already a real doctor in every way that matters," Dr. Foster said firmly. "What we're offering is the opportunity to add formal credentials to your existing skills and knowledge. More importantly, we're offering you the chance to train other women to do what you've done, to create a network of skilled medical practitioners who can serve rural communities that have been desperately underserved." Samuel squeezed her shoulder. Gently, "It sounds like they're asking you to become exactly what you've always been, but on a much larger scale." Mr. Crawford cleared his throat. "There are also legal benefits to consider. As a licensed physician, you would have professional standing that would protect you from any future challenges to your fitness or competence. Not that we anticipate such challenges," he added quickly, "but legal protection is always valuable." Rebecca thought immediately of Thomas Mitchell, who had disappeared after their marriage to Samuel had rendered his custody petition meaningless. But there had been whispers over the years, suggestions that he might return someday to cause trouble. Professional medical credentials would provide protection that even marriage couldn't guarantee. "What about Emma?" Rebecca asked, looking down at her daughter who was listening to every word with obvious fascination. "I couldn't leave her for 6 months. The college has provisions for students with children," Dr. Foster assured her. "Emma would be welcome to accompany you, and there are excellent schools in Colorado Springs. Many of our female students have found that their children benefit enormously from the educational opportunities available there." Emma tugged on Rebecca's skirt. "Mama, what's a medical college?" Rebecca knelt down to her daughter's level, still hardly believing the conversation she was having. "It's a place where people learn to be doctors. Sweetheart, Dr. Foster is asking if I'd like to go there to learn more about helping sick people. And then you'd come back and help even more people?" Emma asked with the practical directness of childhood. "That's exactly right," Dr. Foster confirmed, smiling at the little girl. "Your mama would learn new things and then come back to teach other people how to help their communities the way she's helped yours." Emma considered this seriously. "I think you should do it, Mama. You're the best at helping people feel better. And if you could teach other mamas to do it too, that would help lots of children." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes at her daughter's simple wisdom. This child, born into circumstances that should have marked her as an outcast, was encouraging her mother to reach for opportunities that most women could never dream of achieving. "There's one more thing," Mr. Crawford said quietly. "The position comes with a substantial salary and government backing. You would be financially secure for life, with resources to expand your work and provide for Emma's education and future." Rebecca stood slowly, her mind reeling with the magnitude of what was being offered. 6 years ago, she had been a pregnant girl thrown out of her family home with nothing but $15 and a broken heart. Now she was being asked to become a leader in territorial medical services, to train other women, to build a legacy that would benefit countless families across the frontier. "I need to discuss this with my husband," she said finally. "Of course," Dr. Foster agreed. "This is a major decision that affects your entire family. But Mrs. Hayes, I want you to understand something. In 20 years of medical practice, I've rarely seen someone with your combination of natural skill, practical experience, and dedication to serving others. You have the potential to revolutionize medical care in rural communities across the territory." As the visitors prepared to leave, promising to return in a week for Rebecca's answer, Dr. Henley lingered behind. The elderly physician who had become her mentor and colleague looked at her with paternal pride. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "when I first heard about the pregnant woman living at the old Henderson place, I expected to find someone who needed charity and pity. Instead, I found a healer whose skills surpassed my own in many areas. You've built something remarkable here, something that could change hundreds of lives." "I couldn't have done any of this without Samuel," Rebecca replied, "and without you taking a chance on teaching me." "Samuel gave you shelter and support," Dr. Henley acknowledged. "I shared some book knowledge, but the healing gift, the dedication, the ability to see what people need and provide it, that came from within you. That's not something that can be taught." That evening, as Rebecca sat in the rocking chair where she had once nursed Emma as a baby, she watched Samuel teaching their daughter to whittle small wooden animals from pieces of scrap lumber. The domestic scene was peaceful and perfect, everything she had dreamed of during those dark early months when survival itself seemed uncertain. "You're going to accept, aren't you?" Samuel said without looking up from his whittling. "How did you know I'd already decided?" Samuel smiled, the expression that had become as familiar and comforting as sunrise. "Because I've watched you for 5 years, Rebecca Hayes. You've never been able to turn away from an opportunity to help people, even when it meant personal sacrifice. This offer represents a chance to help more people than you ever dreamed possible. But it means leaving here, leaving you and Emma for months, leaving everything we've built together." "For 6 months," Samuel corrected gently. "And then coming back with knowledge and credentials that will let you do even more good. Rebecca, you were meant for more than just this homestead. You were meant to change the world, one patient at a time." Emma looked up from her whittling project. "Papa Samuel, if Mama becomes a real doctor, will she still be our Mama?" "She always be our Mama," Samuel assured her. "And she always come home to us. But she also be able to help lots of other children and their families feel better when they're sick." "Then she should definitely do it," Emma declared with 5-year-old certainty. "Mama's the best at making people feel better." Rebecca felt the last of her doubts dissolve. This little girl, this remarkable child who had never known shame or rejection, was giving her permission to reach for dreams she had never dared voice. Samuel, the man who had saved her life and taught her what real partnership looked like, was encouraging her to fly even higher than she had imagined possible. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll do it. I'll go to medical college, and I'll come back to build something even better than what we have now." As Samuel and Emma cheered her decision, Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been thrown out for being pregnant, had slept in abandoned barns, had faced threats and legal challenges that could have destroyed her. But each hardship had made her stronger. Each challenge had revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. The frightened girl, who had once clutched $15 and wondered how she would survive, had become a woman who would soon hold medical credentials and lead territorial health initiatives. The baby born in shame had become a daughter who encouraged her mother to dream bigger and reach higher. Most remarkably, the homestead that had begun as a refuge for the desperate had become a beacon of hope for an entire region. People traveled from hundreds of miles away to seek treatment, to learn healing techniques, to find hope when conventional medicine had failed them. Rebecca Hayes, no longer Rebecca Sullivan, no longer defined by her father's rejection or Thomas Mitchell's abandonment, had built a legacy that would outlast her own lifetime. She had transformed personal tragedy into public service, had turned society's judgment into an opportunity to prove what women could accomplish when given the chance. As she tucked Emma into bed that night, her daughter asked the question that would stay with Rebecca through all the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. "Mama, when I grow up, can I help people feel better too?" "Sweetheart," Rebecca replied, smoothing her daughter's dark hair, "you can be anything you want to be. Doctor, teacher, farmer, inventor, anything at all. And no matter what you choose, remember that you have the power to make the world better just by being yourself." Emma smiled sleepily. "I think I want to be like you, Mama. Strong, smart, and helpful." Rebecca kissed her daughter's forehead, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had led them both to this moment. "Then you'll be exactly who you're meant to be." The woman who had once been thrown out for being pregnant had created not just a new life for herself, but a new model for what women could achieve when they refused to accept society's limitations. Her legacy would live on through every patient she healed, every woman she trained, every child who grew up understanding that circumstances of birth meant nothing compared to strength of character. The transformation was complete. But the story was just beginning. 20 years after that cold October night, when 19-year-old Rebecca Sullivan had been thrown from her family home, Dr. Rebecca Hayes stood before the newly constructed Women's Medical Institute of Nebraska, watching as the final cornerstone was set in place. The imposing brick building would house the territory's first comprehensive training program for female physicians, midwives, and nurses, a dream that had grown from those humble beginnings in an abandoned homestead's makeshift clinic. Beside her stood Emma, now 25 and recently graduated from the University of Colorado with a degree in engineering, one of only 3 women in her class. Emma had inherited her mother's determination and intelligence, but had chosen to channel those gifts into designing hospitals and medical facilities rather than practicing medicine directly. The Women's Medical Institute was her first major project, a building specifically designed to accommodate the unique challenges of training women in frontier medicine. "Mama, do you remember when you delivered Mrs. Patterson's grandson in that tiny clinic room at the homestead?" Emma asked, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles as she reviewed the architectural plans one final time. "Now we'll have 16 fully equipped training rooms, a surgical theater, and dormitories for students from across the territory." Rebecca smiled, her weathered hands clasping the brass key that would officially open the institute the following morning. "I remember thinking that saving one baby at a time was the most I could hope to accomplish. I never imagined we'd be training hundreds of women to save thousands of babies." The journey from that frightened pregnant girl to this moment had been extraordinary in ways Rebecca still sometimes found difficult to believe. After completing her formal medical training at Colorado Medical College, she had returned to the homestead as promised, but her impact had quickly expanded far beyond their rural corner of Nebraska. Word of her innovative techniques and successful treatments had spread throughout the medical community, attracting students, colleagues, and government officials who recognized the revolutionary potential of her work. Over the past 15 years, Rebecca had established 7 rural medical clinics, trained 42 female practitioners, and pioneered several treatments that were now being used in medical schools across the country. Her detailed documentation of frontier medical challenges had resulted in 3 published textbooks that were considered essential reading for anyone practicing medicine in rural communities. But perhaps most remarkably, she had never lost sight of the personal touch that had made her legendary among the farming families of Nebraska. Even as her responsibilities expanded and her reputation grew, Rebecca continued to make house calls, to sit with frightened mothers during difficult deliveries, to offer comfort along with medical treatment to families facing their darkest moments. "Dr. Hayes," called a familiar voice from behind them. Rebecca turned to see Samuel approaching, his hair now completely silver, but his step still strong at 65. He carried a leather portfolio containing the official documents that would transfer ownership of the Institute from private funding to territorial oversight, ensuring its long-term survival and expansion. "Mrs. Patterson just arrived," he announced, with obvious pleasure. She insisted on being here for the dedication, even though the journey from Millfield is harder for her these days. Rebecca's face lit up. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 70s, had become one of Rebecca's most stalwart supporters over the years, often traveling considerable distances to testify before territorial legislators about the importance of women's medical education. The elderly woman had never forgotten how Rebecca's herbal remedies had saved her youngest son's life during that terrible winter when no other treatment had been effective. As they walked toward the Institute's main entrance, Rebecca reflected on the complex web of relationships and circumstances that had made this moment possible. Samuel's patient support and business acumen had provided the stable foundation that allowed her to take professional risks. Emma's engineering expertise had solved practical problems that had stymied other attempts to establish medical training facilities in frontier regions. Dr. Foster's mentorship and professional connections had opened doors that would have remained closed to a self-taught practitioner. But perhaps most importantly, the hundreds of families who had trusted Rebecca with their medical care had created a reputation that commanded respect from politicians, academics, and fellow physicians who might otherwise have dismissed a woman's contributions to frontier medicine. "Mama," Emma said quietly as they paused before entering the building, "I've been wondering about something. Do you ever think about Thomas Mitchell? About what happened to him after he tried to take me away from you?" Rebecca considered the question seriously. She had heard rumors over the years that Thomas had married a banker's daughter in Kansas City, that his mysterious troubles had involved gambling debts and questionable business dealings, that his need for respectable marriage had been driven by the same cowardice that had caused him to abandon her in the first place. "I think about him sometimes," she admitted, "but not with anger anymore. Thomas was a weak man who made choices based on fear and self-interest. In a strange way, I'm grateful for his cowardice. If he had stayed, if he had married me as originally planned, I might never have discovered my own strength or found my true calling." "Do you think he knows what you've accomplished?" Emma asked. "Do you think he realizes what he gave up when he ran away?" "I hope not," Rebecca replied, surprising her daughter with the answer. "I hope Thomas Mitchell found some measure of peace and happiness in his life, even if he didn't deserve it. Carrying resentment toward him would only diminish what we've built together." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Your mother learned a long time ago that success is the best revenge, and that the best revenge is living well regardless of what others choose to do with their lives." Inside the Institute, Rebecca was amazed once again by what Emma's architectural vision had created. The building was both functional and beautiful, with large windows that maximized natural light, modern ventilation systems that would prevent the spread of disease, and innovative features like adjustable examination tables and specially designed surgical instruments that accommodated women's generally smaller hands. But beyond the impressive facilities, Rebecca saw something even more meaningful: the future. Tomorrow, 36 women would begin their formal medical training in these rooms. They came from farms and small towns across Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, and the Dakota territories, drawn by the promise of education that would allow them to serve their communities as skilled practitioners rather than merely traditional healers. These women would face many of the same challenges Rebecca had encountered: skepticism from male colleagues, legal obstacles to practicing medicine, family pressure to abandon their professional ambitions in favor of traditional domestic roles. But they would face those challenges with formal credentials, professional networks, and most importantly, the knowledge that other women had succeeded despite similar obstacles. Dr. Hayes called a young woman who approached with obvious nervousness. "I'm Sarah Martinez, and I'll be starting classes tomorrow. I wanted to thank you for making this possible." Rebecca studied the young woman's face, earnest, intelligent, determined despite her obvious anxiety about the challenges ahead. "Tell me about yourself, Sarah. What brought you to medicine?" "My younger sister died in childbirth 3 years ago," Sarah replied quietly. "The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away, and by the time we could get help, it was too late. I decided that no other family should have to watch someone they love die from something that might have been prevented with proper medical care." Rebecca felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came whenever she met someone whose calling to medicine had been forged in personal tragedy. That's a powerful motivation, but also a heavy burden to carry. Medicine will teach you to save many lives, but it will also teach you that you can't save everyone. "I understand," Sarah said simply, "but I have to try. And now, because of what you've built here, I'll have the training to try effectively." As the evening progressed and more students, faculty, and supporters gathered for the informal dedication ceremony, Rebecca found herself thinking about the ripple effects of choices made decades earlier. Her father's decision to throw her out had seemed like an ending, but it had actually been a beginning. Thomas's abandonment had felt like betrayal, but it had opened the door to meeting Samuel and discovering her own capabilities. Even the desperately frightening night she had spent in that abandoned barn, soaked and alone and terrified, had been necessary. Without experiencing absolute vulnerability, she might never have developed the fierce determination that had carried her through medical school, professional challenges, and the countless obstacles faced by women trying to establish credibility in male-dominated fields. "Ladies and gentlemen," Samuel called, tapping a spoon against his glass to call for attention. "Before we conclude this evening, I think it's appropriate to hear from the woman whose vision and persistence made this institute possible." Rebecca stood slowly, looking out at the faces gathered in the institute's main lecture hall. She saw students eager to begin their training, established physicians who had traveled considerable distances to show their support, territorial officials who had provided crucial funding, and community members whose trust in her abilities had made everything else possible. "When I was 19 years old," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I thought my life was over. I had been abandoned by the father of my child, rejected by my family, and left to face an uncertain future with no resources beyond my own determination to survive." The room was completely silent, and Rebecca could see that her personal story still had the power to move people who heard it for the first time. "What I didn't understand then was that endings and beginnings are often the same moment, viewed from different perspectives. What felt like the destruction of my life was actually the foundation for everything I've been able to accomplish since." She gestured toward Emma, toward Samuel, toward the impressive facilities surrounding them. "None of this would exist if my life had gone according to my original plans. Sometimes our greatest disasters become our most important opportunities, but only if we're brave enough to see possibility in the midst of despair." Rebecca paused, thinking about all the women who would pass through these halls in the years to come, each carrying her own story of challenge and determination. Tomorrow, 36 women will begin their medical training in this building. Some of them are here because they've experienced personal tragedy. Others are driven by intellectual curiosity or a desire to serve their communities. But all of them are here because they've decided that their circumstances don't have to define their limitations. She looked directly at Sarah Martinez and the other incoming students. "You will face obstacles that your male colleagues will never encounter. You will be questioned, doubted, and sometimes dismissed simply because of your gender. but you will also have opportunities to make a difference in ways that previous generations of women could never imagine. Rebecca's voice grew stronger as she reached the heart of her message. I want you to remember something as you begin this journey. The woman who stands before you tonight was once thrown out of her family home for being pregnant. I slept in barns, faced threats from dangerous men, and spent months wondering if I would survive long enough to give birth to my child. The room remained completely silent, hanging on every word. But I also discovered strength I didn't know I possessed, found love I had never dared hope for, and built a career that has allowed me to serve thousands of families across this territory. Your current circumstances, whatever they might be, are not your final destination. They are simply your starting point. As applause filled the lecture hall, Rebecca felt a profound sense of completion. The frightened girl who had once clutched $15 and wondered how she would survive had become a woman whose influence would extend far beyond her own lifetime. The baby born in shame had grown into an accomplished engineer whose innovative designs would house the next generation of female medical professionals. Most importantly, the abandoned homestead that had once been their refuge had evolved into an institution that would train hundreds of women to serve their communities with skill, compassion, and professional competence. The transformation was complete, but the legacy was just beginning. In classrooms, clinics, and hospitals across the frontier, women would practice medicine with confidence and competence because Rebecca Hayes had proven it was possible. Children would live because their mothers had access to skilled medical care. Families would remain whole because trained practitioners were available when emergencies arose. The woman who had been thrown out for being pregnant had created a future where no woman would face such challenges alone, where medical knowledge would be shared freely, and where the strength to overcome adversity would be passed from one generation to the next. As the evening concluded and the guests began to depart, Rebecca stood once more in the doorway of the Women's Medical Institute, this time looking out at the stars that had witnessed her entire journey. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to serve and teach and heal. But tonight, she simply stood in grateful amazement at the distance she had traveled and the lives she had been privileged to touch along the way. The girl who had once been abandoned had become the woman who ensured that others would never face their darkest moments alone. That it was, she reflected, more than enough for one lifetime. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.